The town, such as it was called Rio Suchio. It had taken Schaefer some time to get there. On the flight from New York to Panama City, he had worked out a course of action, from what he remembered of what Dutch had said and his own knowledge of how the drug trade operated in Central America. He couldn't be sure there was any connection between Dutch and the drug runners, but it was the way he was betting it, at least for the moment. First stop had been an old friend from Special Forces who'd got himself a job in the DEA. Schaefer had stayed in touch, since it's always useful for a cop working in narco to have contacts in the DEA. That was a good way to pick up information that he might otherwise miss. It wasn't information Schaefer was after this time, though. It was weapons. He'd seen that thing in the tenement. He'd felt its fist. He'd heard Dutch talk about how unstoppable his theoretical super hunter would be, and Schaefer didn't doubt that the killer he was up against was the same one. He wanted something with real stopping power, something that would take down anything he ran up against, including an 8-foot monster. A Vulcan Gatling gun would have been about right, Schaefer thought, but Hansen, his friend at the DEA, couldn't get him one on short notice. He did all right, though, and not just with the weapons. Hansen was able to get Schaefer enough cash, both dollars and the local stuff, to cover whatever other expenses might come up. Of course, he'd put it all on Schaefer's credit cards, but Schaefer had no complaints about the money or the ordnance. He owed Hansen a big favor now. Once he was armed, he had to figure out where to go and how to get there. He was doing all this because he wanted to know more about what he was up against. Dutch had fought it somehow and gotten away alive. He'd lost all his men, and maybe the son of a bitch had caught him later. Maybe Dutch had been skinned alive and hung upside down somewhere eventually, but he had gotten out alive. Once. Maybe he'd left some clues about how he'd managed it. Maybe they were still there, even after 8 years. And maybe Schaefer could learn enough from them enough to ensure that he'd survive too, and maybe even take the bastard down once and for all. First, though, Schaefer had to find out where it all had gone down. Dutch hadn't given him a map, but he'd talked about his rescue mission, and Schaefer could remember damn near every word. Dutch had talked about coptering in over the Pacific, then going up over a ridge and across a border, then heading northeast down a valley to make a pickup. Rio Suchio was a little more than a clearing in the jungle where a dozen huts built in the traditional Palapa style were gathered. The polite liberals back in the Big Apple could call the green hell a rainforest if they wanted, but as far as Schaefer was concerned, and as far as the locals were, it was a jungle. Sweltering hot and thoroughly hostile, and it was all around. The saloon where Schaefer made himself at home was the showplace of Rio Suchio. It had a floor of smooth black dirt with good drainage and nothing growing on it. And the roof was tin over planking rather than thatch. It didn't leak enough to water the drinks, which Schaefer considered a plus, since the bartender watered them down enough to begin with. The windows had shutters, but no glass, which didn't really matter since the screen door had holes big enough to let in buzzards. And even the biggest of mutant mosquitoes in the jungle outside could fit through, if they tried. There were no ceiling fans, no electric lights, and the idea of air conditioning was the wildest of fantasies here. The air felt as hot and thick as soup, and the inside of the saloon was no different in that regard from the jungle outside. The lessened air circulation was roughly balanced by the greatly reduced sunlight. Far more important than any of this, from Schaefer's point of view, was the fact that Rio Suchio was built at the foot of the ridge that marked the border between this particular stretch of Malarian rainforest claiming to be the nation and the next equally backward chunk of jungle. As the real estate folks would say, location, location, location. Rio Suchio might not have been much, but as far as Schaefer was concerned, it had the right location. Dutch had gone over that ridge, Schaefer was sure. Dutch had said that his rescue mission was real hush-hush stuff because of the risk of starting a war. And at the time, this particular pair of banana republics had been closest to escalating their perpetual disagreements and border incidents into something bloodier and more formal. They weren't anymore. And as Schaefer sat at his chosen table, he wondered whether Dutch had had anything to do with this inexplicable bout of reasonableness, or whether it had just been one of the small parts of the general political shifts of the last decade. "Otra cerveza, senor?" the bartender asked. "Si," Schaefer replied, looking up. "And don't spit in it this time." He had no idea whether the bartender understood the English. Around here, Spanish was usually a second or third language, after the local Indio dialect and maybe Maya, and English was a long shot at best. He noticed a shadow on the screen and turned to face the door. A man in green fatigues, tire-tread sandals, and a wide-brimmed green hat stepped in, tall by local standards and bearded. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, while the bartender delivered Schaefer's beer. Schaefer paid for the bottle without ever letting his attention leave the newcomer and left the beer sitting untouched on the table. The man in fatigues had no visible weapons anywhere, but that looked somehow unnatural. He was plainly a man who ought to be armed. He spotted Schaefer quickly enough. There weren't many men in the place, and of those few, there was only one of Schaefer's size and his blonde hair. Even in the dimness, Schaefer was very obviously a Nostro Americano. The stranger crossed the room to Schaefer's table and looked down at him. "I understand that you are looking for a guide," he said in a clear but accented English. "Word travels fast," Schaefer replied, finally picking up the beer and taking a swig. "I'm told you're a policeman from New York," he said after a moment. "That you may have enemies among the La Costa, the Medellin, the Cali." "You have a problem with that?" Schaefer asked. "No," the guide said with a toothy smile. "It just means I charge more." Schaefer shrugged. "It shouldn't matter anyway. I'm not interested in drugs this time. I'm looking for some Nostro Americanos who disappeared over the border 8 years back." "8 years?" the guide asked. Schaefer nodded. "That's right. 8 years is a long time, senor." Schaefer shrugged. "I've been busy. Didn't get around to it until now." "These men, they were all men? No women?" "The Nostro Americanos, si, all men, 6 of them. Dutch's squad had been 6 men, and 5 of them had died somewhere in this goddamn steam bath." "The way you say that," the guide asked, "were there others? You say you are looking for these 6. "There may have been others, but that's who I'm looking for," Schaefer agreed. "Them and something else, something that comes with the heat." The guide considered him thoughtfully. "And what would this be that comes with the heat?" the guide asked. "A man?" "I don't know," Schaefer said. "That's what I want to find out." "Ah," the guide said, smiling. "I see. You're mad, Mr. New York policeman. Which means I charge even more." Schaefer smiled back. "I think we're going to get along fine," he said. So began a journey into the past, a search for the truth about Detective Schaefer's brother, and an old score to settle. The mysterious murders and the cover-ups taking place in New York City were connected to Dutch's disappearance, somehow. And Schaefer was going to get his answers at any cost. The mystery was unraveling from the other side of things for General Phillips as well. Ever since the incident in Central America, the General had been keeping a close eye on activity that could be traced back to these advanced alien hunters. The connection and possible vendetta related to the Schaefers took Phillips by surprise. The pieces started to come together after the second massacre, this time in the subway, which included many of Schaefer's own men from the force. Phillips took note of this man, investigating the scene without authorization, and found him to be unmistakably related to Dutch. He offered a friendly word of warning to the detective when he recognized the name whilst Captain McComb was chewing him out. He intervened. "You called this man Schaefer?" McComb glanced at Schaefer, puzzled. "That's Schaefer, yes," he said. "Well, then you don't want to try ejecting him, because if Detective Schaefer's anything like his brother Dutch, he'll probably dike it, and you can't afford the damage, especially not here." Rashi, Schaefer's partner, threw a startled glance at Schaefer, then stared at this new arrival. "You knew my brother?" Schaefer growled. Phillips didn't answer. Instead, he addressed McComb. "All that's left here is mop-up. Think you janitors can handle that, McComb?" Rashi watched, amazed, as McComb nodded and said reluctantly, "Yes, sir." McComb was a jerk and could be relied on to kowtow to authority and side with civilians against his own men, but Rashi couldn't see why he'd be deferring so obviously to some old coot in fatigues, especially here on police turf. New York wasn't under martial law, and while McComb was always glad to cozy up to the feds whenever the FBI or DEA wanted something, he had never shown any great fondness for men in uniform. He and Schaefer had known that the feds were involved in investigating the massacre, or rather the massacres, plural, now. But they had assumed that feds meant the FBI, not the Army. What the hell did the Army have to do with it, and who the hell was this guy? Rashi squinted, trying to see him better in the dim light, and realized the Army man had 2 stars on his cap. Well, at least it took a general to impress McComb. "Come on, son, we've got to talk," the general said, pointing toward the passage that led back up to the street. "Do we?" Schaefer asked. The general nodded. He turned and started walking toward the stairs. Schaefer followed. So did Rashi. No one had invited him, but they hadn't told him to get lost either, and he wanted to know what the hell was going on, who this general was, and what he was doing in New York, and whatever else Schaefer might be told. No one spoke in the corridor or on the stairs. On the street, the general pointed east, and Schaefer nodded in acknowledgement. They walked on to Fifth Avenue and uptown, still not saying a word. Together, the three men got in a booth in the back of a bar a few blocks away. Rashi and the general took one side, Schaefer the other. For his part, General Phillips was considering the two detectives, Schaefer in particular, and the look on his face. Maybe Dutch, tough as he was the kinder, gentler brother. Dutch had always been able to relax and smile when he wasn't working. This Schaefer looked as if his expression had been carved out of granite. "Bourbon," he told the waitress who arrived by the table. Straight up. "Look, Schaefer," he said, "I know you think McComb's being an asshole about this, and maybe he is, but he's following orders. We told him to keep you out of this." "And who are you?" Schaefer asked. "I can't tell you that," Phillips replied. "And you probably guessed that. I can tell you that your brother used to work for me, back in the 80s, and you probably guessed that too. I don't know if you're as smart as your brother, but you aren't stupid. You're a detective. You can probably guess at least half of what I could tell you. And the rest, you're better off not knowing." The waitress returned with the drinks. Again, Phillips waited for her to depart. "I'll tell you, Schaefer," the general said, sitting back, trying to relax the atmosphere a little. "Dutch saved my ass on more than one occasion. He was a good man. A hell of a good man." He swigged his bourbon. "He used to talk about you sometimes, brag on his brother back in the States." "Where is he?" Schaefer asked. He wasn't drinking. Rashi had ordered a beer to be sociable. Schaefer hadn't bothered. He sat stiff and straight, staring at Phillips, though he had gone so far as to loosen his tie. "Where is he?" he repeated. "What happened to him?" Phillips didn't answer. He looked down at his drink, took a puff on his cigarette, then looked back at Schaefer. "This meeting is off the record," he said. "It never happened. You got that?" Schaefer didn't answer. His expression made it plain that he was still waiting for an answer to his question and didn't give a shit about any record. "I'm not here. I'm not telling you this. You never saw me. All that crap," Phillips said. "But I owe you this much, for Dutch's sake. Drop this one, son. Just back away from it. Forget about it." "I can't do that," Schaefer said. "You saw that shooting range. Those were cops. Those were my men." "You've got to drop it," Phillips replied. He reached for his hat. "You've got to. Understand?" He didn't dare stay any longer. He'd let something slip up if he stayed. He was tempted to tell Schaefer all of it, but he didn't dare. So he had to leave, and leave quickly. He didn't trust himself if he stayed, and he didn't trust Schaefer. He'd read about some of Schaefer's stunts. Schaefer studied Phillips. "You already know who these killers are, don't you? You know who was behind these slaughters. You came to New York to check them out, maybe to cover them up, didn't you? And you know Dutch. He worked for you. There's some connection there. These killers are somehow connected to Dutch." He started to rise. "Who the hell are they?" Phillips was on his feet, straightening his hat. He didn't answer. "Who are they?" Schaefer demanded. He stood, clenched his fists at his sides, towering over Phillips. "What the hell are they doing? What do they want in New York?" Phillips shook his head. "I can't tell you anything, Schaefer. Drop it." "Why now?" Schaefer asked. "Dutch has been missing for years. Why are these murders happening now? Who is it killing both cops and punks?" He started to reach for Phillips. The general stepped back, out of reach. "I can't tell you," he said. "Well, what the hell can you tell me? Don't tell me you can't tell me anything, Phillips. Give me something." Phillips hesitated. "They like the heat, damn it," he said uneasily. "They want the sport. Look, leave them be, and in 2-3 weeks, they'll be gone. Mess with them, and God only knows what might happen." He hesitated again, then added, "And that's all. I've already said too much." In the doorway, Phillips turned. "Believe me," he called. "It's gotta be this way." And he was gone. Schaefer, of course, was far from letting any of this go. While working with very little, Schaefer did know more than he let on. Conversations he had with Dutch, as vague as they may have been, held possible clues. Rashi, though supportive, also had his line. He couldn't make heads or tails of the mystery that consumed Schaefer, but he knew as well as his partner that something out of the ordinary was going on. He reflected on where this all had led them so far and the enduring plight of the good detective. Cops in New York tend to get used to things, like the time some live wire tied a cow to the chairman of Federal Beef and pitched them both off the top of the Chrysler building. It was supposed to be some kind of protest against chemically treated meat, but when that Jersey pancaked into Lexington Avenue, all hell broke loose. City sanitation must have gone through a dozen mops cleaning up the mess, but they didn't care. Free steaks for Christmas. The point is, that's the job. You learn to deal with it. Having the crap kicked out of you and being pitched off the 5th floor, that was something else. Even McComb would have trouble believing Schaefer tripped out of a window, but I recognized the look in Schaefer's eyes. Something big was up, and he needed to deal with it, alone. What had happened to Schaefer? I'd never seen him take a beating like that. What did Phillips say? They liked the heat? The sport? They'd talked over what it was, where it came from, what it was after, all of it guesswork, of course, but Schaefer had that last chat with Dutch to help him. He thought the thing was a hunter, the kind Dutch had talked about. Probably the one Dutch encountered. After all, how many more could there be? Schaefer told Rashi the thing wasn't human, but he admitted he hadn't got a good look at it. He'd only been in the same room with it for a few seconds and in poor light. Rashi didn't comment on that. But Dutch had run into it in Central America, and this one was in New York. Well, it had 7 or 8 years to find its way north. Maybe it had already gotten Dutch and was going on after his family. Or maybe Dutch had gotten away, and it had mistaken Schaefer for his brother. In any case, Schaefer figured that it was toying with him, playing cat-and-mouse games, killing Schaefer's own natural prey at the downtown tenement, killing Schaefer's allies on 20th Street, marking Schaefer. Schaefer didn't think the thing had intended to knock him out of the building, that it had been an accident. And it hadn't bothered coming down after him because it wanted the chase to continue a bit longer. It didn't want to kill him while he was helpless. It wanted the sport of hunting him. It had tagged him like a baby seal. Why? It was all guesswork, all just talk, and that was all Schaefer and Rashi did that first evening. With the journey to come, Schaefer had to go it alone. Rashi knew that, and he knew he could not follow. Schaefer explained. Dutch's last phone call mentioned some kind of rescue mission near the Colombian border. Something had happened down there. Something that ties into the murders. That thing. All of it. And he offered a warning to his partner. Get the wife and kids away from the city. Have them stay with your parents. Tell them it's a vacation. Anything. I've got a feeling something ugly's going down. That's going to make our Colombian friends look like something out of a Dr. Seuss book, by comparison. The days had passed. General Phillips looked over the latest weather reports and frowned. The heat wave was still hanging on. Summer was slipping away, but the hot, humid air was holding steady over the city, and temperatures were staying in the 90s or above. The pollution count was well into an unhealthy range, but New York's unwelcome visitors wouldn't give a shit about that. Hell, according to Dutch, they wore those masks. They probably didn't breathe the local air in the first place. Though, they apparently could, if they wanted to. They could do just about any damn thing they pleased, it seemed. The radar report showed that faint, unnatural interference was still out there. Not that he really needed that. He could just turn on a TV and didn't have cable and see if the reception was still lousy. Phillips was pretty sure, despite from all the fumfering from his scientists, that the interference came from those damn alien ships. The police reports were the only encouraging sign. There hadn't been a third massacre yet. At least, not that anyone at the NYPD knew of, but who knew what sort of slaughterhouse scenes might be lurking undiscovered. It was a big city, and it had been a long time since most New Yorkers could be bothered to be their brother's keepers. Of course, usually those things let their victims get a few shots off, just to make it interesting, and that might still draw some attention in most neighborhoods. So, maybe they really hadn't struck again. But if that was the case, why hadn't they? What were they waiting for? Phillips read past down the summary into the body of the report, usually left that for underlings, but he didn't want to risk missing anything on this one. Sealing off the scene at 20th Street had made some trouble. That was no surprise. He'd tell his boys to hurry it up and get that place reopened. The local cops were never going to stop hassling about it as long as there were reminders there, in their own basement. And hassling those things would just get more good men killed. The only way to deal with the creatures was to leave them alone. Let them have their fun. When they'd had enough, they would go home. That reminded him of Dutch, and Dutch's brother. He began flipping through the report, looking for some mention of Schaefer. That stubborn son of a bitch wouldn't leave anything alone, Phillips was sure. He spotted Schaefer's name and paused, then stared. God damn it, he said. Captain McComb had ordered Detective Schaefer dismissed from the NYPD. The Union was fighting it, but for the moment Schaefer was off the force. That would just make Schaefer more determined than ever to get whatever had trashed the firing range, and now he'd have all the time he needed for it, without the hassle of any paperwork or office politics to worry about. It took another day in Rio Suchio to put everything together. Schaefer had thought he had all the supplies he needed, but the guide had other ideas. He found 2 mules and stocked up on rope, blankets, camping gear, and arcane herbal remedies, as well as more mundane concerns such as food and fresh water, and a few boxes he didn't bother to open for his unappreciative gringo employer. No weapons were visible in the guide's acquisitions, though, not even a knife. Schaefer noticed that and asked about it. In reply, the guide shrugged. "You have already done that, senor. I will trust you have what we need." Later, as they were climbing the ridge, the mules zigzagging back and forth up the slope, the guide told Schaefer that he used to do recon work for the U.S. military. Schaefer didn't argue with that, or ask for proof, but he didn't necessarily believe it either. The guide might trust Schaefer as far as the armaments went, but Schaefer didn't trust the guide, about weapons or previous recon work or anything else. But then Schaefer didn't trust much of anyone, and nobody at all in that particular hellhole. "What you're looking for, these 6 men who came here 8 years ago," the guide had said. "I think for that you want to head up to Mengabi." Schaefer decided not to ask what gave him that idea. He just shrugged and followed. They camped in the jungle on the south side of the ridge, each night a little higher than the night before. Early on the 3rd day after leaving Rio Suchio, the guide announced that they were crossing the border. Schaefer took his word for it. One stretch of hilly jungle looked like another, as far as he was concerned, and crossing the border didn't make the air any cooler, the humidity any less, the undergrowth any easier to get through. The only difference Schaefer could see was that the ground was now mostly sloping downward rather than up. They'd crossed the top of the ridge as well. Half a day later, the 2 men and their pack mules arrived at the spot in the jungle where the guide had stopped, smiling, and waited expectantly. He didn't say anything, he just waited, and it took Schaefer a moment to realize what he was supposed to be seeing. And that something here made this particular place more different than the rest of the country. He looked, but at first he only saw more of the damn jungle. Then he made out the straight lines in the greenery ahead. This was what the guide wanted to show him, what the guide had been aiming for. Schaefer was looking at the remains of a camp of some kind. He grunted to let the guide know he eventually figured it out. Then he dismounted and walked cautiously forward. As he poked around in the ruins, Schaefer found a rusted, blackened metal object he eventually identified as the burned-out remains of a helicopter. Other smaller objects might have been a flatbed truck and a generator, and elsewhere there were fragments of steel drums, pieces of ammo boxes, sections of stone flooring, some of it burned, all of it encrusted with moss and vines. There were no bodies, but after 8 years, there wouldn't be. The guide had said something about guerrillas and rebels. Schaefer didn't bother to listen to that. It was clear enough, even now. This had been a staging area of some sort, and someone had come calling with some heavy-duty shit. Brass shell casings turned to green and black corruption by the jungle were strewn everywhere. Schaefer could see blast patterns in the debris and rapid-fire trails in the burned-out and rusted remains of vehicles and machinery. Schaefer had a pretty good idea of who it was who'd dropped in. It smelled like one of his brother's operations. Messy, but thorough. He wondered why. Dutch had been in the rescue business, not search and destroy. Had there been hostages here? There could have been, certainly. So if Dutch had gone in after the hostages, had he gotten them out? Did it matter? Dutch wouldn't have lost all of his men in an operation like this. An ordinary hostage recovery. That sort of stunt had been his bread and butter. Schaefer frowned, then returned to his mule. There wasn't anything here that was going to help him. He could spend weeks digging through the rubbish, and he doubted he'd find a clue if he tried it. "There are no winners in a place like this," the guide said, sententiously. "Only the jungle." "Shut up," Schaefer told him as he swung himself awkwardly into the saddle. He wasn't in the mood to hear bad movie dialogue. If the guide thought that sort of crap was going to impress anyone, he'd picked the wrong employer. "Which way?" he asked when he had his mount under his control again. "How am I to say, senor?" the guide asked. Schaefer turned in the saddle and glared at him. The guide's smile vanished. Perhaps this way," he said, pointing. Schaefer nodded and followed as the guide rode on. A mile or two past the camp, they headed northeast, down a narrow valley. It didn't look like the best route to Schaefer, but the guide led the way, and Schaefer didn't argue. The jungle looked different here, thicker, and somehow almost alien. Schaefer could see it in the trees, the plants, everything. and it was hotter than ever. On the 4th day after leaving Rio Suchio, they crossed a small river and picked their way down to the side of a cliff into a broader valley where a good-sized river flowed. Here, the jungle was even stranger. Schaefer looked around warily, trying to decide whether the strangeness had anything unnatural about it. "Do you feel it?" the guide asked, noticing Schaefer's discomfort. "You said you were looking for a thing that comes in the heat." It was hot enough, certainly. "This is where the natives say the sun appeared at midnight once, on a very hot night 8 years ago," the guide said with a sweeping gesture. Schaefer didn't answer. He was staring ahead. There was a break in the jungle, a hole where golden sunlight poured in. There was more than that, Schaefer saw as his mule emerged into the light. There was a crater. Most of it was green. Of course, nothing could hold the jungle back for long. It was still plain that sometime, not all very long ago, something had cut a hole in the jungle a quarter-mile across. It blasted away everything. Any normal explosion big enough to do that should have taken truckloads of explosives, and there should be visible wreckage, even now, and there wasn't. "My God," Schaefer said, staring. "What the hell happened here?" He sat and looked at the devastation for a moment longer, then demanded, "And what the hell did that bastard do to my brother?" He wondered whether he was looking at Dutch's grave. Probably not, since he knew Dutch had gotten out of there alive once, but had he come back? Had he died here? If not Dutch, had his men died here? Billy and Hawkins and Blaine and the rest? And he also wondered what a Geiger counter would register here. The crater looked big enough to have been made by a small nuke. Who would be throwing that kind of ordnance around? He spent the remainder of that afternoon crisscrossing that crater, looking for some sign of what happened, something that might tell him what he was up against. He didn't find it. There were no fragments, no scraps of wreckage, nothing he could find to indicate what had made that hole. At last, he slogged back up out of the mud and asked the guide, "Now what?" The guide shrugged. "I do not know," he said. "The trail ends here." Schaefer knew that for bullshit. The guide hadn't been following any trail. He had known where to go. Schaefer supposed the destroyed rebel base and this crater were famous. All the locals would have heard about them. They would know that they dated back to 8 years ago. This would be the natural place to lead someone who came looking for men who had vanished all that time ago. But that seemed to be all this man knew, or at least all he would admit to. It looked as if there might be another dead end, but Schaefer wasn't in any hurry to give up. "We camp here," he said. The guide shrugged. That night Schaefer sat up late by the fire, thinking and remembering. He remembered that Dutch had talked about that thing as a hunter. He was staring into the dying embers of the fire, thinking about that, when the thing in his neck suddenly jabbed at him. Not digging into the artery, but doing something that hurt. Even distracted by the pain, he knew what that had to mean. He'd never felt anything like it before, but he'd have to be an idiot not to understand. The thing that had marked him was getting his attention, letting him know that it hadn't forgotten him. And it wouldn't bother doing that if it was back in New York. It must have followed him. "Son of a bitch," he growled, clenching his fists in pain. "He's here." He looked around, scanning the jungle. He didn't see it anywhere. He knew it was out there, though. Maybe he wasn't going to find any clues to the thing's origins here. Maybe the crater wouldn't tell him anything, but he'd have a chance to tackle it again. And if he could kill it, who would care where it had come from? The guide watched with interest as Schaefer unpacked and checked out some of the little presents he'd got himself from his pal from the DEA. He'd built the fire back up enough that both men could see what Schaefer was doing. "That is a very big rifle," the guide remarked at one point as Schaefer assembled the contents of a steel suitcase. Schaefer hefted the weapon in question. "This," he said, "this isn't a rifle. It's a shotgun, full auto. 6 rounds a second. You hear it popping, you get the hell out of here. Comprende?" "Comprendo," the guide replied. That shotgun was the centerpiece of Schaefer's armament, but he also had a more ordinary automatic rifle slung onto his back. And grenades and knives on his belt. He wanted to be ready when he met that big, ugly motherfucker. The twanging sensation in his neck was getting stronger. Schaefer assumed that meant the thing was getting closer, and he tried to hurry. He didn't want to be standing there, chatting with the guide as it came for him. He didn't want the mules to get caught in the crossfire either. And he did not want to screw up by rushing. He checked each weapon carefully but quickly. He had to work by firelight, which didn't help any. There were flashlights and a lamp in the pack of supplies, but Schaefer had no intention of using them. That would make him a bit too visible. When his preparations were complete, he told the guide, "Stay here." Then, with the auto shotgun held at ready, he charged off into the jungle, choosing his direction more or less at random. more concerned with getting away from the mules and finding someplace with cover so that the bastard couldn't just pick him off from a distance like some stupid 2-point buck hanging around a clearing, than with getting any particular destination. The throbbing lessened slightly as he moved into the blackness of the surrounding jungle, and Schaefer began to weave back and forth, moving slowly and as silently as he could in the tropical darkness, trying to figure out from the sensation just where his enemy was and which way it was moving. It wasn't hard to estimate. When he moved toward it, the gadget hurt more, and when he moved away it hurt less. Simple enough. Before he'd covered half a mile, he thought he knew where the creature was. It had caught him by surprise, back there in New York, but this time he was ready. This time he knew what he was up against. Maybe not what the thing was, or where it came from, or what it was doing here, but he knew roughly how big, and how strong, and how fast it was. Bigger and stronger and faster than he was. Schaefer knew that, but somehow he didn't care. He was sure he could handle it anyway. For one thing, the arrogant bastard was probably planning on some kind of one-on-one duel, a test of wills, all that macho crap. Why else would it have warned him with that gadget on his neck? That was bluster, a challenge, an invitation to come out and fight like a man. It wanted to prove how tough it was, in a fair fight. Schaefer wasn't worried about proving his manhood, he just wanted the thing dead. The best way to do that, he figured, would be to come up behind it and blow its head off. With that in mind, he was circling around trying to come at it at a contracting spiral. He would know he was getting closer, but with any luck, it wouldn't know which direction he was in. "You want a mano, creep?" he muttered to himself. "That it? Hand to hand, may the best man win? Well, fuck that. You can just kiss my..." Blue-white fire exploded from a tree behind him, turning the forest darkness into bleached-out chaos. The roar echoed through the darkness beyond. Shit, he dropped, diving behind the nearest available plant life. The thing fired again. This time Schaefer saw the flash as he dived, saw the charge, whatever it was, coming in. The instant he touched dirt, he flung himself aside. The blast tore through another tree. For a moment it hung, suspended by the tangle of vines and branches, then it sagged and toppled. By the time the echoes of the initial explosion had faded, and well before the shattered tree thumped into the surrounding jungle, Schaefer had taken cover behind a low ridge of stone that thrust up through the undergrowth. "So much for mano a mano," he muttered, annoyed at himself for making assumptions about what the thing wanted. But, on the other hand, that first shot hadn't been anywhere near him. A warning shot, he guessed. The bastard did want the hunt and the kill to be a challenge. The second shot had been serious, though. The hunter wasn't going to be obsessive about making things hard on itself. And that shot had been damn close, despite the darkness. Could the thing see in the dark? Was it using infrared or some other kind of high-tech stuff to aim? Another shower of blue-white fireworks blossomed up from the other side of the rocks. "Okay, that's two," Schaefer said. "My turn." He jumped up, shotgun ready, and cut loose, spraying slugs at the point those blasts had come from. He couldn't aim properly in the dark, not with the risk of incoming fire, but he'd gotten a pretty fair idea of where that last fireball had come from. The roar of the gun on full auto was deafening, and its flash lit the jungle a sick yellow-green. Schaefer was aiming at the crotch of a tree, but he realized he couldn't see anything there but flying wood chips and leaf fragments as his slugs tore through the greenery. He released the trigger and dived sideways, looking for cover. His hearing was of no use to him. His ears were ringing from the shotgun's thunderous rapport, and he cursed himself for not considering that when he chose his weapons. His eyes were slowly adjusting to the darkness again, now that no weapons were flashing. He crept forward through the underbrush. He didn't hear any movement, but his ears weren't working. He couldn't see anything moving either, but it was fucking dark. The monster might be right on top of him, and he wouldn't know it, or it might be back in its tree. It wasn't shooting at him, though. Had he hit the thing, knocked it right out of the tree, killed it, or at least wounded it? Or was it hiding somewhere? Had it dived for shelter in time? Could it dive out of a tree that high, without injury? Schaefer knew that he couldn't have. But the creature was bigger and stronger and faster than he was. He couldn't tell if he had hit it, so he decided to take the battle to it, to try to take the initiative. Shotgun in one hand, assault rifle in the other, he charged out of concealment toward the tree. Bad move. He didn't even see what hit him. He didn't understand that. How could he not see something that big, even in the jungle dark, if it was that close to him? His ears were still out, but his eyes were okay, weren't they? But he didn't see it. Just something slammed him across the chest, and he went over backward, weapons flying. Something shimmered faintly in the moonlight. It wasn't the creature he had fought in New York, with its yellowish skin. That would have shown up in the distance. Instead, there was something green and black and hard to see even though it was only a few yards away. Camouflage. The damned perfect camouflage. It was the same creature. The size was right. Blue sparks were crawling through the darkness 10 feet away. Ribbons of electricity were twisting around a dark outline. And the whole thing flickered like a TV screen in a thunderstorm. Sometimes green and black section of the jungle, sometimes something else. It was moving closer. And then it flashed once, and the flickering was gone, and the creature he had fought in New York was standing there, over him, looking down at him. Something was dripping from its arm, something greenish-yellow that glowed like liquid neon. Schaefer understood now how the thing had been able to move through New York City so easily without ever being spotted. And if that glowing stuff was the creature's blood, and not just the equivalent of hydraulic fluid for its gadgets, Schaefer thought, it was hurt. If it could bleed, it could die. He came up fast as he could, combat knife in hand, and the blade punched through the thing's mesh and into its grayish flesh. "This is for Dutch," Schaefer shouted. The sound was muffled, his hearing was still shot. The creature roared in pain, and that too was dull, almost inaudible. Before Schaefer could even think about dodging, its foot came up and kicked him away, hard. The knife stayed inside. Schaefer guessed that the bastard hadn't expected anything like that. He had it figured. This thing chased and killed people for sport, like a big game hunter. It didn't expect to get hurt. The game was supposed to struggle, but it wasn't supposed to fight back. To the creature, people were prey, not competition. So he'd surprised it. But the surprise was all done now. When he landed, he scrambled up and headed away from the thing. He couldn't fight it on even terms, not even with a knife in its side. It still had that weird little cannon on its shoulder, the one that had blown holes through the walls back in New York and had chopped down trees here in the jungle. Schaefer thought it wouldn't want to use the cannon, not at close range. That wouldn't be sporting. But if he came at it again while it was wounded, it might decide to play it safe and blow him away. So he ran and hoped the thing would be too busy with the knife wound to come after him right away. He figured while it was distracted, he could go back to the mules and put together enough firepower to handle the son of a bitch. Even with the auto shotgun gone, there was still plenty more in that case from Hansen at the DEA. Then his foot slipped, and he caught himself at the last second. He'd lost track of where he was, which way he was going, and had just come within inches of charging right off a cliff into a river. "Oh shit," he said, and he still couldn't hear his own voice. And before he could step back, the thing's claw closed on his head from behind, its fingers over his eyes, the long black talons digging into his cheeks. He hadn't heard a thing, hadn't known it was there. Even without its invisibility gadgets, it was better at concealment than it had any right to be. It picked him up, lifted him by that grip on his head, and for a moment Schaefer dangled as helplessly as a puppy. Then it flung him against the nearest tree. He landed hard and sat, stunned and unable to move as the thing marched up to him. He looked up at it and spat, still defiant despite his helplessness. "You ought to tell your hairdresser," he wheezed as he saw the black, bended tendrils dangling down either side of the creature's head, swaying and catching in the moonlight. "That Rasta shit's been out of style for years." He didn't know whether he had actually spoken aloud or not. His ears were still out. Schaefer rolled and grabbed up a fallen branch as thick as his own leg. He came up swinging and caught the creature solidly on the side of the head. A blow like that would have killed a man, but this bastard didn't even stagger. It just flung up an arm to ward Schaefer off and turned away. It was standing on the edge of the cliff, facing away from him, partially blinded and thoroughly distracted. Its camouflage still not working, and Schaefer knew this had to be the best shot he would ever have. Maybe his last shot. He lowered his makeshift club into a spear and charged. The wood splintered with the impact, and Schaefer was knocked backward. The creature tottered, swayed, and then fell over the brink. Schaefer's hearing was beginning to return, finally, enough that he had heard the sound of the impact. At first he thought his ears were still fucked up somehow, because this wasn't a thud, like a body hitting the ground. It was a crunch. He waited, dazed, for the creature to climb back up. When it didn't, he crept forward and peered over the edge, half expecting a blue-white fireball to take his head off at any minute, or a claw to grab his face. Nothing hit him. Nothing moved. The creature was lying there motionless, sprawled across the trunk of a fallen tree, with a big smear of that yellow-green goop across its chest, glowing in the darkness and lighting the scene. And thrusting up from the center of that luminous smear was a pointed, broken-off tree branch that had punched right through the bastard. That didn't necessarily mean the fight was over. Schaefer tried to tell himself that. Maybe that wasn't where the creature's heart was. Maybe it was not just bigger and stronger than anything human, but tougher in ways Schaefer couldn't even imagine. Maybe there were still some surprises left in it. But maybe not. To Schaefer, the thing looked deader than hell. In New York, the Predator had gotten the best of Schaefer, leaving him beaten and bloodied and no further to the truth about his brother. If this rematch between the New York homicide detective and the alien hunter from beyond space brought any kind of closure, or signified any kind of justice served for whatever fate had fallen upon Dutch, it was short-lived. For in Detective Schaefer's victory, events were already in motion, all leading to an interspecies war and an open hunting season in the streets of New York. For more on Detective Schaefer, you can check out the playlist on the end screen, which includes more concrete jungle-related topics, including the first fight that left Schaefer briefly on the outs, and more about General Phillips and his mission. Also, before I go, I would like to mention and stress that this isn't a paid promotion or anything. I'm just looking out that recently Dark Horse Comics released their Predator collection, Predator: The Essential Comics. The collection includes Concrete Jungle, as well as other Detective Schaefer-centered stories like Cold War and Dark River. Those are undeniable essentials when it comes to the Predator comics, so definitely not a bad Christmas gift idea for the Pred heads close to you. There are precious few shopping days left, so keep your mind on the hunt, my friends. Good luck out there. As always, I'd like to thank you very much for watching today. I really appreciate it, and if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a like, and you can also subscribe for all the latest videos from the channel. This video was definitely on the longer side, so let's try something a little bit new. If you made it all the way to the end, if you heard all I had to say about the big fight, include #4Dutch in your comment, if you'd like. A very, very special thanks today goes out to WEYLAND YUTANI executives, EmYarUk and Lady Anne, part of the Patreon Hive. If you'd like to join the Hive and support the channel, check out my Patreon page for exclusive posts and contests. In the meantime, you can catch up with Alien Theory over social media. Follow @alien_theory on Twitter and @alientheoryyt on Facebook and Instagram for more. And until next time, this is Alien Theory, fighting off a winter cold, signing off.